It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend hiking through a section of the Appalachian Trail I hadn't tried before. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, long ones too, so I didn't think much about doing this one alone. The section I picked wasn't particularly dangerous, just long and mostly empty. I wanted the quiet. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and I just needed a few days where I didn't have to hear anyone talk or look at a screen. I started early on a Friday morning. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the trees had started to thin out for the season, leaving the forest floor buried under dead leaves. The sound of them crunching under my boots was oddly satisfying. I had about 25 miles to cover before I'd reach the point where I planned to camp for the second night, so I wanted to get a head start. My backpack was heavy: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water filter, all the usual stuff. It felt good though, that familiar pull of weight on my shoulders that always meant I was out of the world for a bit. By the time I hit the first ridge, the sun was fully up, and I had a decent view of the valleys below. I stopped for a short break, took a few photos, and then moved on. A few miles later, I reached a small wooden sign pointing toward a side trail that wasn't marked on my map. The wood looked new compared to most of the trail markers, like someone had made it themselves recently. It just said, "Old Quarry, 2 miles." I didn't plan to go off course, but I made a mental note of it. If I made good time, maybe I'd check it out later. The first day went smoothly. I didn't see a single person after noon, which wasn't too unusual in that section. The wind picked up in the afternoon, blowing through the trees with that low, hollow sound that always makes me feel like I'm deeper in the woods than I actually am. By the time I set up camp that night, it was almost dark. I picked a flat area near a stream, made dinner, and turned in early. The forest was dead quiet, except for the sound of water trickling nearby. I woke up around midnight. I didn't know what woke me at first, but something felt off. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no water, nothing. I lay still, trying to listen for any sound, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent. The kind of steps that come from someone trying to move quietly but stepping on dry leaves anyway. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but the pattern of steps sounded too deliberate. It paused, then started again, circling slightly around where I was camped. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed the small knife I always kept near the tent door. I wanted to yell, to make noise and scare whatever it was off, but something in my gut told me to stay silent. I waited like that for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just listening. Then, nothing. The footsteps stopped completely. I stayed awake for another hour, my muscles locked tight, before I finally drifted off again out of exhaustion. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent as soon as it was light. The ground was covered in dew and leaves, but I saw them right away. Footprints. Human footprints heading down toward the stream and then back toward the trail. They weren't mine. They were larger, spaced wider apart, like someone had walked slowly around the camp before leaving. I tried to convince myself it was just another hiker who passed by and maybe didn't realize I was there. Still, something about the pattern felt intentional. I packed up fast and got back on the main trail. I told myself I'd hike farther than planned that day, put some distance between me and whoever it was. But the longer I walked, the more unsettled I felt. Every time I stopped for water or to check my map, I had this prickling feeling on my back, like I was being watched. Once, when I turned around quickly, I thought I saw movement, a flash of something dark between the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Around noon, I reached the split where that side trail to the old quarry was. Out of pure instinct, I looked down it. It was narrower than the main trail, half covered in fallen branches, like no one had used it in years. But something caught my eye, a fresh boot print right at the entrance, pointing in the direction of the quarry. The same pattern I'd seen near my camp. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the strap of my backpack, staring into the shadowy path. I had no reason to go that way, but the idea of walking past it, turning my back to it, made my skin crawl. I finally forced myself to keep going straight, staying on the main trail. The next few hours felt endless. Every bend in the trail made me tense up, half expecting someone to appear. Late in the afternoon, I reached the second campsite I'd marked on my map, a clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a few flat spots for tents and a small fire pit made of stones. There were no signs of anyone else around. I set up camp quickly again, but I didn't light a fire this time. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate a cold dinner and sat listening as the forest darkened around me. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint sounds. A branch snapping, something moving in the distance, maybe an owl far away. But one sound stood out, and it came just before dawn. The faint clink of metal, like something brushed against a carabiner or a pot. My stomach turned cold. I knew I hadn't moved anything that could make that sound. When I finally got up, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the ground, about 20 feet from my tent, was a piece of orange fabric. It was torn, old, and muddy, but it looked like part of a backpack strap. Someone must have dropped it recently, because the dew hadn't fully soaked into it yet. I didn't know what to make of it, but I shoved it in my pocket anyway and started packing up. I just wanted out. The trail back toward the nearest exit point was about 10 miles. Felt like 50. Every noise made me look over my shoulder. Once I caught what sounded like breathing, faint, rhythmic, coming from the trees off to my right. I stopped moving, holding my breath. It went quiet again after a few seconds, but by then, my nerves were shot. I started walking faster. By the time I reached the parking lot where I'd left my car, it was early afternoon. There were only 2 other vehicles there, an old white pickup and a Forest Service truck. My car looked untouched, but something about that pickup caught my eye. The bed was filled with camping gear, ropes, buckets, tarps, and what looked like old tools. The license plate was covered in dirt, barely readable. I didn't linger. I threw my pack in the trunk and got in the car. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced once more at the trailhead. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing there, tall, wearing a dark jacket, just beyond the sign. I blinked, and the spot was empty. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe not. When I got home, I couldn't shake the unease. I unpacked my gear and pulled out that torn strap I'd found. Something about it looked familiar. A week later, I was scrolling through an online hiking forum, reading posts from people who'd gone missing on the trail or had strange experiences. One thread mentioned a hiker who disappeared a few years back near that same section. Someone who'd last been seen headed toward an old quarry that wasn't on most maps. The photo attached to the post showed the missing man's gear, and hanging from the side of his backpack was that same orange strap. I never went back to that area again. I started hiking with friends after that, never alone. Sometimes, when I think about that night and those footsteps circling my tent, I wonder if whoever it was knew I was awake. I wonder if they were watching to see if I'd move, or if they were just waiting for me to. All I know is, I've done dozens of hikes since then, mountains, deserts, forests, but I've never again felt that same kind of silence. That thick, heavy stillness that tells you you're not as alone as you think. It was around the same time last year when I decided to join 2 friends for a night hike. We were going out to one of those rocky desert trails a few miles outside town, the kind that twists through low canyons, loose rock, and tall saguaro cacti. The plan was to use UV lights to look for scorpions. I'd done it a few times before, and it always had that weird mix of calm and unease. The desert at night feels different. Open, silent, but somehow alive. It's beautiful in its own way, with the air crisp and dry, carrying a faint scent of creosote and dust. There were 3 of us that night and a little dog. A small brown mix, maybe 10 pounds, that belonged to one of my friends. We started the hike just after sunset, letting the sun drop fully before pulling out the lights. The scorpion hunt was always better in complete darkness. The UV flashlights turned everything they touched into strange glowing shapes, and the scorpions would show up like neon green shards against the dirt. The trail wound through low brush and scattered cacti, wide enough for us to walk single file. I took the caboose position, the last in line, mostly because I liked looking back now and then. It gave a strange comfort, seeing how the trail disappeared into the blackness behind us. The desert doesn't have much noise at night. Every sound stands out. The crunch of our shoes against sand and gravel. The small panting of the dog. the hum of insects in the distance. About a mile in, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. It wasn't just the desert stillness. It was heavier than that, the kind of silence that feels like it's watching you back. I didn't think much of it at first. I kept my light aimed at the ground, sweeping the beam across rocks and dry grass, waiting for the next little glowing creature to pop up. Then I caught something, not with the UV light, but with my peripheral vision. It was movement, sudden and sharp, off to the right side of the trail. My head turned just in time to see something drop off a ledge and disappear into the brush below. It was fast, too big to be a rabbit, too quiet to be a deer. The way it moved was deliberate, smooth. My stomach tightened immediately. I stopped walking for a second and aimed my regular headlamp toward the spot. The beam lit up the tangle of scrub and cactus, but whatever it was had already gone silent. Couldn't see a thing. I stared for a while, trying to convince myself I had just imagined it. Maybe a big bird or something slipping away from the light. Still, the back of my neck felt tight. As we continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every few steps, I'd glance behind, sweeping the darkness with my light. Nothing. But every time I turned back forward, I'd feel that tingle again, like I was being watched. The desert night has a way of playing tricks, but this didn't feel like that. It felt focused. A few minutes later, the air felt heavier. The quietness was absolute now. The dog, who had been sniffing around and trotting along happily, was walking closer to its owner's legs, tail down. I started walking slower, keeping my headlamp low, and that's when I saw it again, a shape low to the ground just off the trail behind us. My light caught a brief flash of tan fur and a long, curved tail. It was gone just as fast, melting into the dark. My pulse spiked. There wasn't any mistaking that shape. A mountain lion. My legs felt like they weren't mine for a second. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew better. Running only triggered them more. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but every exhale felt too loud. My hands were shaking slightly as I adjusted the light. I scanned behind us again and again, but it stayed just out of view, somewhere between the shadows and the cactus line. We started walking faster, staying close. The little dog was almost being carried at that point. I turned around every few seconds, walking backward now so I could keep an eye on whatever was trailing us. My headlamp cut through the dark, bouncing off rocks and brush. And then, for just a heartbeat, it caught something solid, the faint gleam of eyes, then the sleek line of a body crouched low. The light slid over its back, revealing the unmistakable muscular shape and that long, smooth tail. It was close, maybe 50, 60 feet behind. My chest felt tight. It was real. It was stalking us. We didn't talk, we didn't need to. The change in our pace said everything. Every crunch of gravel underfoot echoed too loud in my ears. The air felt thick, almost hard to breathe. The trail curved slightly downhill toward the parking lot, and for the first time all night, I could see faint artificial light, the reflection of a single parked car's headlights on the metal sign near the trailhead. That glow felt like the safest thing in the world right then. We stuck close, a small tight line moving steadily forward. I was still walking backward, keeping my beam trained on the darkness behind us. My arms were starting to ache from holding the light so steady, but I didn't dare let my guard down. The lion stayed hidden, but I could feel it, that instinctive pressure you get when a predator is close, when the world around you narrows down to just breathing and moving and hoping it doesn't make its move. The parking lot finally came into view. A flat open area of dirt and gravel with a single car sitting there, engine off, windows fogged slightly. Seeing that car was the first time I felt some small sense of relief, but it was mixed with that raw animal panic still sitting heavy in my gut. Then, maybe 30 feet from the car, I saw motion again. The lion slipped through the scrub along the edge of the lot, a smooth blur of muscle and shadow. It was close enough that I could see its shoulders moving as it crept, its head low, tail straight behind. It wasn't in a rush, it was careful, quiet, studying us. It wanted the little dog. That much was obvious. It's strange how long a few seconds can stretch when something like that happens. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the dry smell of desert air. I remember trying to keep the light fixed on it, not wanting to lose sight of it again. The man in the car, who'd been there the whole time unaware, eventually turned his headlights toward us after being asked. The beams cut across the scrub and lit up the lion completely. That sight is burned into my memory. A full-grown mountain lion, standing there about 20 feet from the trail, body frozen in the light, its eyes reflecting back in that eerie golden glare. It looked huge, easily twice the size it probably really was, every muscle visible under its coat. For a moment, it didn't move. It just stared back at us, tail twitching once. Then, as soon as it realized it was fully exposed, it turned and bolted into the dark, silent, smooth, gone in seconds. The desert swallowed it up again like it had never been there. I didn't feel relief immediately. It was more like disbelief, like my body was still waiting for it to come back. We stood there in the wash of those headlights for a long time, not really saying much, just letting our bodies catch up to what had just happened. My legs were trembling slightly. The adrenaline left me shaky, but I couldn't stop replaying the last half-mile in my head. The feeling of being watched, the weight of those unseen footsteps following us through the dark. That night stuck with me. I'd gone out on plenty of night hikes before, searching for glowing scorpions under UV light, never once thinking about how much of that desert belonged to something else. It's easy to forget that out there, in the dark, you're not on top of the food chain. You're just another thing moving through someone else's territory. Since then, I've still gone out. A few times, anyway. But it's different now. I'm more alert, more aware of the quiet moments and the way the air changes when something's nearby. I carry a stronger flashlight, sometimes even a hiking stick. The fun of those scorpion hunts is still there, but there's a weight to it now. An understanding that the desert's beauty and its danger live side by side, always watching from the shadows. And every time I turn my light toward the darkness, there's a small part of me that expects to see that pair of golden eyes again, just waiting beyond the edge of the trail. Summer nights have a strange kind of peace in the desert. The days are brutal. The heat pushes down on everything. The air feels like it's coming from a furnace, and the rocks hold that warmth long after sunset. But once the sun slips below the horizon, everything changes. The world exhales. The wind picks up. The sky opens wide and full of stars, and the heat fades into something tolerable, something that makes you want to stay out there a little longer. Out where I live, scorpions are just part of the scenery. They come out when it's dark, crawling over the rocks, the dry grass, the patios, anywhere the earth still holds a trace of warmth. We're used to them. It's just how the desert is. But to people from out of town, there's something wild, almost alien. So whenever friends visit, we grab our UV flashlights and head out past the back fence, into the open desert, to show them how they glow like neon signs against the dirt. It was one of those calm nights, dry air, maybe 75 degrees, faint smell of dust and sagebrush. I could hear cicadas buzzing somewhere out near the wash. We had a couple of cheap UV flashlights and a regular headlamp, and we were just walking slow, sweeping the beams across the ground. Every few feet, a small green glow would appear. A tiny scorpion, sometimes curled up, sometimes moving lazily, unaware or uncaring that it was being watched. Their glow under the UV always fascinated me. The way their armor lit up so bright, like someone had charged them with electricity. We started maybe 50 yards from the house, then wandered further, past the mesquite trees and the dry fence line. The land behind my place stretches for miles before it hits any real development. It's open desert, rolling terrain scattered with rocks, cholla, and the occasional rusted metal post. You can hear coyotes sometimes, but mostly it's still, silent except for the sound of your own footsteps. I've done those scorpion walks more times than I can count, but that night had a different kind of quiet to it. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Even the insects had gone silent. I noticed it after a while, how the air seemed heavier, how the silence felt like something was holding its breath along with us. I didn't say anything. I just kept my light aimed low, moving it slowly over the ground. We were maybe a quarter mile from the house when I spotted a cluster of scorpions near a large flat rock. It was unusual to see so many in one place, 5 or 6, all glowing like tiny bits of broken glass under the UV light. I crouched to take a closer look. Their bodies were so still that for a moment I wondered if they were dead. But then one twitched, lifting its pincers slightly. I could see the sand around it shifting from the faint breeze. The air was dry, no sound except the hum of the UV lights and the distant bark of something way off. Maybe a coyote, maybe a dog from one of the ranches. I stood up, dusting my knees, and started to turn my light outward again. That's when I caught something out of place. A shape in the dark, low and still, maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't glowing, obviously, just a dark mass against darker ground. At first, I thought it was a rock, but then it shifted. It wasn't much movement, just a small adjustment, like something repositioning itself slowly, quietly. The kind of motion you don't notice unless you're already looking straight at it. My body reacted before my mind caught up. Every muscle went tight. The desert has plenty of things that move. Foxes, javelinas, even stray dogs sometimes. But this didn't look or move like that. It was heavier, deliberate. I raised my headlamp and switched it on. The beam cut across the sand and caught the edge of the shape. For a moment, I saw the smooth curve of a back, the faint reflection of eyes that caught the light. Yellowish, wide apart, too high off the ground to belong to something small. I felt the air leave my chest in one slow breath. A big cat. It was far enough that I couldn't make out all the details, but close enough to know it was watching. His head was low, body flat to the ground, tail stretched behind it. It wasn't moving toward us, not yet, but it wasn't leaving either. It just stayed there, half hidden by the scrub and the uneven ground, its eyes fixed. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The whole desert seemed to shrink down to that one spot. The stars, the scorpions, the dry smell of dirt. It all blurred together. I stood completely still, only my flashlight beam shaking slightly. The animal didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, it turned its head away, gliding behind a cluster of cacti. The movement was smooth, controlled. I didn't like that. When predators move like that, slow, quiet, it means they're not afraid. It means they're deciding. We started walking back toward the house, not rushing, but keeping a steady pace. The desert has this strange way of magnifying every sound. The crunch of our steps, the faint rattle of loose pebbles. It all sounded too loud, like it was drawing attention. I kept glancing behind, switching my light back and forth, scanning the darkness for any hint of eye shine. For a while, there was nothing, just the occasional scorpion lighting up on the ground, little reminders that the desert was still alive beneath us. About halfway back, I thought I heard movement, something soft, like padded steps over dirt. It was far back, faint, but real enough that I froze for a second. My headlamp swept over the area, but there was nothing visible. The desert gives you space, but it also gives you nowhere to hide. You can feel when something's out there, even if you can't see it. The trail curved near a cluster of boulders and a dead mesquite tree. I knew the area well. It's where the ground dips before rising again toward the house. I remember thinking how far the porch light looked, barely visible through the brush. I kept my light steady, the beam shaking only when my hands started to tremble. My mind was racing, counting the distance, thinking about how fast a mountain lion could close that gap, wondering if the smell of sweat or movement was enough to keep it interested. And then, maybe 50 yards behind us, I caught that faint reflection again. 2 eyes, just for a second, before the beam bounced off the dirt. It was staying parallel to us, same pace, same distance, ghosting along the side of the trail. I could picture it moving silently between the cactus and the rocks, never rushing, never losing focus. My legs felt heavy, like I was dragging them through sand. Every instinct screamed to run, but running in the desert at night is a quick way to break an ankle or worse. So I kept walking, steady and controlled, every muscle tense. The dog, thankfully, was quiet that night. I kept my light moving, never letting it rest too long in one spot. The last stretch felt endless, just a slow climb uphill toward the faint glow of the house. When we reached the fence line, I turned my headlamp around one last time. The light caught the slope behind us, sweeping over rocks and brush. I didn't see eyes this time. No movement. Nothing. Just open, empty desert under the stars. But that emptiness didn't comfort me. It felt like something had just stepped back into the dark, waiting for us to disappear inside before it did the same. Back at the porch, I turned off my light and stood for a moment, staring out into the night. The desert looked calm again, like it always does, silent, harmless, pretending it had never been watching. The scorpions still glowed faintly here and there, their light fading as the UV beams shut off. It was peaceful again, almost too peaceful. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, the way they hovered just at the edge of the beam, patient and silent. It made me realize how thin the line really is between being the observer and being the observed. Out there, you think you're just watching bugs under a light, but you're not the only one hunting, not the only one curious. I still go out sometimes, but not as far. I stay within sight of the porch light now. I keep my back toward the house instead of the open desert. The scorpions still glow like they always have, tiny pieces of life crawling through the dirt. But every time I shine that UV beam, I can't help but glance up, scanning the darkness beyond the fence. Because now I know what's out there in the silence, watching just beyond the reach of the light. It was still dark when I started the hike. The air in Hawaii that early in the morning has this strange mix of warmth and dampness, like the night hasn't quite let go yet. The sky was a dull gray blue, the sun still trapped behind the ridgeline. My boots crunched softly on the dirt trail, and the sound of the forest waking up surrounded me. Distant waves crashing somewhere below, birds beginning to chirp, and the faint hum of insects blending into one constant noise. I'd been hiking alone for about 30 minutes when my stomach suddenly made that unmistakable sound. The kind that's not just a grumble but a warning. I stopped walking, pressed my hand against my gut, and realized the coffee I had back at the hotel wasn't sitting right. It wasn't going to wait much longer. I looked around, hoping maybe there was an outhouse or a porta-potty near the trailhead. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, and the humidity made every movement feel heavy. My stomach twisted again, sharper this time. I sighed through my nose, trying to think. Going out in the woods wasn't really an option. The trail was surrounded by thick brush and big green leaves that looked wet and sticky. I wasn't trying to squat in there and risk getting bit by something. A few steps back toward the parking area, I noticed a small blue shape near the treeline. It was one of those single porta-potties that construction crews or park services drop off. I felt a wave of relief. I practically jogged toward it, slowing down only when I got close enough to smell that familiar chemical stench leaking through the cracks in the door. I didn't care. I just needed to go. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me harder, thick and sour. It was dark, pitch black except for the faint bit of light coming through a vent up near the top. I didn't bother closing the door all the way yet. I set my small hiking pack against the wall, then stepped in fully and let the door latch shut. I heard it click. The sound of the outside world dimmed. All that was left was the muffled sound of waves far off and the occasional buzz of flies near the corners. I squatted over the hole, got my business done as fast as I could, and finally felt that kind of relief only nature can give. My eyes had adjusted a little, but it was still way too dark to see much. I reached up and clicked on my headlamp, letting the beam spill across the blue plastic walls. The light bounced around, catching the graffiti scratched into the surface and a few dark spots that looked like dried mud. Or maybe not mud. I turned the light toward where I thought the toilet paper would be. There was a small metal bar with a roll hanging on it, but right above it, in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, something moved. My brain didn't even register it at first. I thought it was a shadow. Then it twitched and the light caught it just right. A spider, a massive one. Its legs were thick, long, and brown with little bands of yellow near the joints. The body was the size of my palm, and with the legs spread out, it had to be 5 inches across. It looked unreal, like something out of a nature documentary. A banana spider. I'd seen pictures before, supposedly harmless, but that didn't matter when one was right above your shoulder inside a tiny plastic box. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. The headlamp beam reflected off its eyes, 2 tiny greenish dots staring right back at me. It didn't move at first, and I told myself not to freak out, to just move slow. I still needed toilet paper, though. That was the problem. The roll was hanging right underneath the spider. I took a deep breath through my nose, trying not to make any sudden movements. I slowly reached forward, my hand shaking a little. The beam of light followed my hand and hit the spider directly. That's when everything went to hell. The thing started moving so fast it looked like a blur. It darted sideways, then dropped a few inches, jerking like it couldn't decide where to go. I flinched hard. My knee hit the plastic wall, and the headlamp bounced around wildly. The light made the shadows jump, and suddenly the spider was running in frantic circles, its long legs tapping against the plastic like tiny claws. I didn't even know what sound came out of me, but it wasn't a calm one. My heart was slamming so hard in my chest that it hurt. The spider stopped for half a second on the wall near the floor, then shot straight toward me. It happened faster than I could react. 1 second it was on the wall, the next it was gone from view. I felt something brush my ankle, light and quick, and then horror, the unmistakable crawling sensation inside the cuff of my underwear. My brain just short-circuited. Every instinct screamed to move, to do anything, but I was half-squatted, pants halfway down, in a filthy plastic box. I could feel it moving. It was inside the fabric, right between my legs, scratching at my skin with those fast legs. I started shaking my hips, side to side, hoping it would fall out. The movement made the porta potty rock slightly. I was breathing in these fast, shallow bursts, and the light from my headlamp was swinging wildly, making the shadows look alive. The spider wasn't leaving. I felt it move higher, up my thigh, quick little bursts of motion that made my entire body tense. I tried smacking at the fabric, but that just made it move faster. It climbed higher, the movement sharp and deliberate, and that's when something in me snapped. I didn't care about anything else anymore. I burst out of that porta potty like it was on fire. The door slammed open so hard it banged against the side. The early morning light hit me full in the face, and I stumbled out into the open, pants still tangled around my ankles. My boots scraped against the dirt, and I half ran, half hopped away from that plastic death trap, yelling without even realizing it. The air was cool compared to the humid heat inside. My heart was pounding in my throat. I looked down, trying to see if it was still on me, slapping at my legs and shaking my clothes like a lunatic. Nothing. I didn't see it anywhere. I kept turning in circles, scanning the ground, the inside of my shorts, the dirt. Nothing. It was gone. I stood there for maybe a full minute, breathing hard, staring at the porta potty like it was alive. The quiet of the morning felt louder now. The birds, the rustle of leaves, even the sound of waves below seemed sharper. I was sweating, the kind that sticks to your back and makes your shirt cling. I pulled my pants back up slowly, still looking around, half expecting the spider to come running back out. After another minute of silence, I finally zipped up and leaned on my knees, trying to calm down. I didn't see anyone else around. Thank God. If someone had been there to watch that, I don't think I could have lived it down. When I went back to grab my pack from inside the porta potty, I hesitated at the door. My light was still on, lying sideways on the seat, the beam lighting up the far wall. I scanned every corner before stepping back in. The spider was gone. Not in the corner, not on the walls, not anywhere. That somehow made it worse, because that meant it was out there somewhere. Maybe in the folds of my clothes, maybe still crawling through the dark cracks of the plastic walls. I wasn't sure. I picked up my gear fast and backed out, keeping my eyes on every inch of blue plastic as I went. The smell hit me again, that mix of chemical and decay, and I decided I'd hold it for the rest of the trip if I had to. When I got back on the trail, the sun was just starting to rise over the ridge. The light spread across the jungle, golden and soft, but I couldn't shake the feeling crawling over my skin. Every time a leaf brushed my leg or a fly buzzed by, I flinched. My nerves were fried. Halfway up the trail, I stopped to catch my breath and noticed a faint tickle on my calf. I froze. For a second, I thought it was happening again. I looked down slowly, my chest tight. It was just a piece of grass stuck to the sweat on my leg. I laughed under my breath, one of those shaky laughs that doesn't sound right. By the time I reached the overlook, the whole thing almost felt unreal. But I couldn't stop replaying it. The sound of those quick legs hitting plastic, the weightless touch of it climbing into my clothes, the blind panic that made me forget everything except getting out. I never saw that spider again. I checked my pack, my clothes, everything twice. It had vanished just like that. But the image of it, the way it moved, the way it felt, stuck with me. Even now, every time I step into a porta potty, I can't help but check every corner before sitting down. That morning, standing there half-dressed in the humid Hawaiian air, I learned something I'll never forget. It's not the big things in the wild that get you. It's the small ones. The ones that move fast, hide well, and leave you wondering if they're really gone, or just waiting for you to let your guard down again. It was my second morning hiking in Hawaii, and I'd started early, before the sun had really burned through the clouds. The trail I'd picked wasn't very long, but it was steep and humid, the kind of trail that gets your shirt soaked with sweat within the first 20 minutes. The air smelled like wet soil and flowers, heavy and sweet. Everything around me dripped with moisture. The trees, the ferns, the rocks. Even the wind felt like it was carrying mist. I'd had a small breakfast at my hotel, but about halfway up the first incline, my stomach started twisting. At first it was just a dull pressure, the kind that makes you shift your pack a bit and keep walking, but within a few minutes it was bad. Sharp, sudden cramps that made me stop and hunch over, pressing a hand to my gut. I looked down the trail, hoping no one was behind me, but I was alone. I knew what it meant. My body wasn't asking for a break. It was demanding one. I wasn't too far from the trailhead, maybe a 10-minute walk downhill, so I turned around fast, trying to keep my steps light while my stomach churned like a storm. The thought of trying to go behind a bush crossed my mind, but the ground was soaked and everything was crawling with insects. The idea of squatting in that thick jungle didn't sit right, so I hurried back toward the small parking lot where I'd seen a porta potty earlier. The trail was slick with mud, and I nearly slipped twice before I reached the open space where the trees broke apart and the blue box came into view. It stood alone by a cluster of banana plants, the kind of plastic toilet you could smell before you saw it. I didn't care. I just needed it. I pulled the door open, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The air was thick, hot, stale, and filled with that sour mix of disinfectant and human waste that clings to the back of your throat. The walls were scratched with names and stickers from hiking groups. There was a small vent near the top letting in weak daylight, just enough to make out the edges of the seat and the roll of toilet paper hanging by a thin metal bar. I hooked my backpack onto the door latch, wiped some sweat off my face, and sat down, just trying to breathe through the discomfort. When I was done, I reached for the toilet paper, but my hand caught only air. I leaned a bit to the side and realized the roll wasn't there. It had fallen off the holder and rolled somewhere near the back corner of the porta potty, where the light didn't reach. I pulled out my small headlamp from my bag, clicked it on, and aimed the beam toward the dark corner. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was part of the wall, just a dark patch, but then my eyes adjusted, and I froze. It was a spider, a massive one. Its legs were long and thin, splayed wide across the corner, and its round body shimmered faintly in the light. It wasn't moving, but it was big enough that I could see its eyes reflecting the beam back at me. I felt my throat tighten. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was disbelief. I'd seen pictures online of Hawaiian banana spiders, but I hadn't expected something this large, this close. Its legs had that faint brown-yellow pattern, and its body was the size of a golf ball. I could see small details, tiny hairs on its limbs, the way it shifted slightly when the light hit it. I stayed completely still, my headlamp shaking in my hand. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I told myself it was fine, that these spiders weren't dangerous. I remembered reading about them. The Hawaiian garden spider was harmless, the cane spider only mildly venomous. But logic didn't matter much when something like that was hanging a few feet away from my bare skin. The toilet paper roll was right underneath it. I stared at the spider, trying to figure out if I could reach for it without disturbing it. It hadn't moved since I'd turned on the light. Maybe it wouldn't care. Maybe it would just stay there, doing its spider thing. I stretched out my hand slowly, every muscle in my arm stiff. The paper was almost within reach when one of its legs twitched. Not much, just a small, deliberate movement, but enough to make my chest seize up. I pulled my hand back immediately. My heart was racing so hard it made my whole body shake. The headlamp beam quivered against the wall, and I realized if I made another sudden move, it might come down or worse, jump. The air inside the porta-potty suddenly felt too thick, too close. I grabbed a few tissues from my pocket, barely enough, and decided that was all I needed. I wasn't going to sit there one more second. I pulled my pack down, unlatched the door, and stepped out into the bright sunlight, my body covered in cold sweat. Outside, the world felt normal again. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, and birds chirped somewhere in the distance. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, staring at the blue box like it might start moving. I could feel my pulse still pounding in my neck. After a few minutes, I started laughing quietly to myself. It was that weird kind of laugh that comes out when the fear drains off and you realize how stupid you probably looked inside there. Just a grown adult terrified of a spider that wasn't even poisonous. I shook my head, stretched my shoulders, and started back toward the trail, trying to let it go. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The size of it, the way it had twitched, just enough to let me know it was aware of me. Every few minutes as I walked, I felt the phantom sensation of something brushing against my arm or crawling on my neck. I'd stop, slap at myself, then keep walking, embarrassed even though no one was around. About halfway up the trail again, I felt something sharp on the inside of my elbow, like a pinch. I stopped instantly and looked down. Nothing there. No spider, no bug, just a small red spot starting to form. Maybe it was a mosquito, I thought, or a thorn from a plant. I kept walking, but an hour later, the spot had swelled slightly. My arm was sore, like I'd bumped it hard against something, and my head was starting to ache faintly. I tried to tell myself it was just the heat, the humidity, dehydration maybe, but as I climbed, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe that spider had been closer than I realized. Maybe, when I'd been pulling my pack off the hook or leaning down, it had fallen. Maybe it had brushed against me without me noticing. The rest of the hike was a blur. I made it to the overlook at the top, a wide view of the ocean stretching into the horizon, but I didn't stay long. My arm was throbbing now, the dull pain spreading up toward my shoulder. The headache was worse, pounding behind my eyes. I made it back down the trail in record time. The sun was high by then, the air thick and buzzing with insects. I reached my car, threw my bag inside, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to steady myself. My skin was hot, my heart still beating too fast. By the time I got back to town, the pain had faded, replaced by exhaustion. I showered, drank water, and lay down in my hotel room, watching the ceiling fan spin. When I finally felt normal again, I grabbed my phone and looked up Hawaiian cane spider. The photos made my stomach twist all over again. That was it, the same long brown legs, the same size. The articles all said the same thing. Mildly venomous, not aggressive, rarely bites unless provoked. I thought about that moment inside the porta-potty, the roll of toilet paper brushing the wall, the twitch of its legs. I must have startled it without realizing it. Maybe it fell onto my sleeve when I jerked back. Maybe it bit just once, quick, before it dropped away. I hadn't even felt it at the time. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every tick of the air conditioner sounded like a skittering leg. I checked my clothes, my shoes, my backpack, every corner of the room before finally closing my eyes. The next morning, I packed my things and checked out early. I didn't hike again that trip. I drove to the beach, sat in the sun, and thought about how sometimes the smallest things in nature can rattle you more than anything else. The bite healed in a few days, leaving just a faint red mark that lasted a week. The memory stayed much longer. I still hike often, but I never step into a porta-potty on a trail without shining a light into every corner first. And every time I see the word banana spider in an article or a post online, I don't think about the harmless species or the technical names. I just remember sitting in that hot blue box in the middle of the Hawaiian jungle, staring at a pair of unmoving eyes in the dark, wondering if I was one wrong move away from finding out how mild that venom really was. I was hiking early one morning on Oahu, planning to get a good start before the heat and the crowds rolled in. It was one of those popular but still semi-wild trails. Lush, quiet, with ferns taller than my waist and thick vines hanging across the path. The kind of place that feels alive even when nothing's moving. I'd had coffee and a light breakfast back at my Airbnb, but about 30 minutes into the hike, my stomach made that familiar, unpleasant twist that every hiker knows too well. It wasn't something I could just walk off. It was urgent. I knew there was a small parking area with a couple of porta potties near the start of the trail. I passed them on my way in, thinking I wouldn't need them. Now I was regretting that. I turned back, fast, trying to keep a steady pace while my stomach cramped in protest. The air was already warming up, heavy with humidity, and I could feel the sweat running down my back. The smell of wet plants and soil was strong, almost suffocating. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, I was practically jogging. The parking lot was still empty except for my rental car and a couple of dusty Jeeps. The porta potties sat at the far end, half hidden by tall grass and banana trees, their blue plastic sides streaked with dirt and mold. The air around them had that sour chemical smell that never really goes away, no matter how new they are. I yanked the door open, stepped inside, and shut it behind me, instantly regretting every life choice that led me to this moment. The heat inside was unbearable, humid, stale, and filled with the thick chemical scent of disinfectant mixed with the unmistakable smell of what dozens of people had done in there before me. I balanced my pack on the wall hook and sat down, trying to ignore everything around me. It wasn't until I was done that I realized I couldn't see a damn thing. The porta potty was dim even in daylight, and the light coming through the vents didn't reach the corners. I reached for my headlamp in my bag and switched it on to find the toilet paper. The beam of light flicked over the door, the floor, the sides of the plastic walls, and then stopped dead in the corner. There it was, a spider. Not small, not even medium-sized. A huge, round-bodied thing sitting perfectly still in the upper corner, right where the wall met the ceiling. Its legs were long and spindly, easily stretching out wider than my hand. I'd seen pictures of Hawaiian spiders before, but nothing prepares you for seeing one up close, especially when you're half-dressed and trapped in a plastic box with it. For a split second, I couldn't move. My body just locked up. The headlamp beam made its shadow stretch and twitch across the plastic wall, and that was somehow worse than looking at the real thing. It was yellow and black, its legs patterned with faint brown stripes, and it just sat there, motionless, like it was watching me decide what to do next. I slowly shifted my weight forward, trying not to make sudden movements. The last thing I wanted was to startle it. I'd read somewhere that these big Hawaiian spiders weren't dangerous. The Hawaiian garden spider was harmless, and the cane spider was only mildly venomous. Still, when something that big is a few feet from your face, logic takes a backseat. I reached, slowly, for the toilet paper that was hanging just below it. Of course, that was the only roll. I tried to tear off a few squares as gently as possible, but the roll spun, and the paper brushed the wall near the spider. It flinched just slightly, and one of its long front legs twitched downward. That was all it took for my heart to explode in my chest. I jerked back so fast I almost fell over. The headlamp beam shook wildly, making the spider's shadow leap across the walls like it was moving in every direction at once. I froze again, watching it, waiting for it to come down on me, but it didn't move after that. It just settled back into that eerie stillness. I finished as quickly as I could, hands shaking, trying not to look up again. I grabbed my pack, hit the door handle, and pushed out into the sunlight. The blast of fresh air felt like being reborn. I stood there for a second, bent over, catching my breath, heart still pounding like I just run a marathon. After a minute or so, I started laughing. It was a nervous laugh, the kind that comes when you realize how ridiculous you must have looked panicking over a spider. I told myself it was fine. It was a harmless species. It probably saw me as nothing but another animal passing through. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those long legs and the way it had twitched, like it had been ready to drop at any second. I splashed some water on my face at a nearby spigot and started back up the trail. The forest was quiet again, full of that low rustling sound that comes when the breeze stirs the leaves but doesn't move anything else. For a while, I managed to push the whole thing out of my mind. About an hour into the hike, I stopped to take a drink and heard something faint. A light rustle just off the trail, followed by a quick movement through the brush. I turned, scanning the trees, expecting a bird or maybe a mongoose, but I didn't see anything. I moved on, but the sound came again a few minutes later, this time from the other side. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, just enough to make me uneasy. I stopped again to adjust my pack, and that's when I felt it. A tickle, light but unmistakable, across the back of my neck. I froze. Could have been a leaf, a piece of hair, anything. But the feeling was so distinct, slow, like something crawling. I reached up, brushed at my neck, and felt nothing. Then I turned my head slightly and caught a glimpse of movement on my shoulder. It was small, brownish, and fast. Gone before I could even see what it was. My brain instantly connected the dots. The porta-potty spider. Somehow, one of them must have hitched a ride on my pack when I was inside. Maybe it fell, maybe it crawled in when I wasn't looking. The thought made my stomach twist again. Not from pain this time, but pure dread. I swung the pack off my shoulders and dropped it onto the dirt. I checked every strap, every pocket, the seams, the zippers. Nothing. I sat there in the middle of the trail, breathing hard, heart racing again. The forest felt like it was watching me. I kept imagining that spider crawling somewhere inside the pack, waiting to come out again when I stopped. I told myself I was overreacting. I strapped the pack back on and kept moving, but I couldn't relax. Every little brush of my shirt or itch on my skin made me twitch. When I stopped for lunch near a small overlook, I pulled everything out of my bag again. My food, my clothes, my gear, just to make sure. Still nothing. By the time I made it back to my car in the afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs ached, my shirt was soaked through, and my nerves were completely shot. I tossed my pack in the trunk, got in the car, and sat for a while before starting the engine. When I finally did, I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit and froze. Hanging from the backseat headrest, maybe 6 inches from the window, was a spider. Not as big as the one from the porta-potty, but close. Brownish gray, flat, legs splayed out like a star. It was perfectly still. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. For a moment, I didn't move. Then I rolled the window down, grabbed a map from the passenger seat, and gently pushed it toward the open air. It didn't move at first. Then suddenly it scurried up the paper and disappeared out the window. I slammed the glass shut and just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the trees outside. The ride back to town was silent except for the hum of the tires and my own heartbeat in my ears. When I got to my Airbnb, I left my gear outside, shaking every piece before bringing it in. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every sound of the wind brushing the window made me think of legs skittering across the walls. The next morning, I packed everything up, dropped off the rental car, and flew home. That was over a year ago. I still hike, but I've scratched Hawaii off my travel list for good. Every time I see a web glinting between branches, I think of that dark blue porta-potty and the shadow on the wall. And every time I reach for my backpack, I check the straps, because once you've felt something crawling on your neck in the middle of the jungle, you never really forget it. It was late June when I took a trip out to Arizona to hike some of the desert trails I'd been saving for years. I'd always loved the quiet of the desert, the endless open space, the still air, the heat that pressed against you like a weight but somehow felt calming. I was used to mountain trails and dense forests, but something about the wide emptiness of desert hiking felt more honest. Nothing to hide behind, no shadows to make your imagination run wild. Just sand, rock, sun, and you. The trail I picked wasn't far from Sedona. It wasn't one of the popular ones, just a long, looping path through low canyons and dry washes. I got there just after sunrise. The sky was pale orange, the kind of color that makes the whole desert glow. The air was still cool, and the red dirt under my boots was packed and dry. I slung my backpack over one shoulder, made sure I had enough water, and started walking. The first few miles were perfect, quiet, still, peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the faint buzz of insects waking up in the heat. I followed the main path, then veered onto a smaller side trail that led through a rocky stretch lined with desert brush and spindly cacti. The kind of terrain that looks harmless until you're standing in the middle of it, realizing how far you are from anything. About an hour in, I stopped near a cluster of rocks to take a short break. I sat down in the shade, took a drink of water, and pulled out my phone just to check the map and make sure I was still on track. While I was sitting there, I noticed a small hole in the ground near my left foot. It looked like any other hole you'd see out there, round, clean edges, maybe 2 inches across. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then, just as I was about to stand, something moved. It was quick, barely noticeable. A flicker of something inside the hole, like a ripple of movement under the sand. I leaned closer, squinting. The hole was dark, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just a shadow. Then I saw it. A pair of legs, thin and jointed, sticking just barely out of the hole, moving slowly like they were testing the air. I jerked back so fast I nearly dropped my phone. My heart started pounding immediately, that instinctive rush of panic you get when something feels wrong before your brain even knows why. I stared at the hole again. The legs had vanished. The hole looked empty, perfectly normal. I told myself it was nothing, some desert bug, a harmless spider maybe. But something about those legs stuck with me. They weren't small. They looked thick, with short hairs on them that caught the light. I shook it off, got up, and kept hiking. The rest of the trail climbed higher into a canyon, weaving through red rock walls that looked like they'd been carved by water 1,000 years ago. The air was hotter now, the sun beating down hard. Every once in a while, I thought I saw movement in the corners of my vision. A flicker near a rock, a shadow across the sand. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I reached the halfway point around noon. There was a flat, shaded area with a few large boulders where I decided to stop for lunch. I dropped my pack, sat down on a rock, and pulled out a sandwich. As I ate, I noticed another hole in the sand near my boots. Same size, same shape. I leaned over to take a closer look and felt that same uneasy chill run up my spine. This hole looked fresh. The sand around the edge was clean, no debris or pebbles like the other one. I could see a faint depression in the center, like something had just moved inside. I didn't stare long. I got up, brushed off my hands, and decided to keep walking while I still had daylight. Not long after that, I started feeling it, this weird prickling sensation along the back of my legs. At first, I thought it was just sweat or sand sticking to my skin, but it didn't go away. It felt like something brushing lightly across my calves, just enough to make me flinch. I kept glancing down, half expecting to see something crawling there, but there was nothing. I tried to focus on the trail, but my nerves were shot. Every rustle of dry grass made me tense up. I thought about the hole again, the legs, and how easily something that size could hide under the sand. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that there were hundreds of harmless insects in the desert, and that I just happened to notice one. But that didn't help. Once your mind goes down that road, it's hard to pull it back. By the time I started heading back toward the trailhead, the sun was low and the shadows had stretched long across the ground. I was sweating, exhausted, and my skin itched like crazy. I stopped once to pour some water over my hands and legs, thinking maybe I'd brushed against some kind of desert plant that caused irritation. As the water ran down my calves, I froze. Something tiny, almost the color of my skin, slid off my leg and dropped into the sand. It was a spider, small but fast. It scurried toward a crack between two rocks and disappeared before I could even blink. I stood there, heart hammering. Then I noticed another one, this time on my backpack strap. A thin-legged brown spider the size of a coin. I dropped the pack instantly and brushed at my clothes. The spider scattered, disappearing into the dirt. I checked the bag carefully, shaking it, turning it upside down, making sure nothing else crawled out. When I was sure it was clear, I zipped it up tight and threw it over my shoulder. That last mile back to the car felt endless. My brain wouldn't stop replaying that image of the first hole, those long legs, the way they moved. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was setting and the desert had gone quiet again. I sat on the edge of the trunk, drinking the last of my water, staring out at the darkening rocks. When I got back to my motel that night, I showered twice. I checked my bag, my clothes, everything. I found one more small spider inside the mesh pocket on the side of my backpack. I caught it with a cup and slid it outside, trying not to crush it. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of spider it had been. The legs from the hole, the smaller ones on my bag, were they the same kind? I tried to remember the color, the shape, the way they moved. Out of curiosity, I grabbed my phone and typed in something like Arizona spider holes in desert. The search results filled instantly with pictures. My stomach dropped. The first few images showed what I'd seen exactly. Those clean, round holes with large spiders peeking out just enough to see the legs. They were called solifuges or camel spiders. Some people called them wind scorpions. Not technically spiders, but close enough. They were fast, aggressive hunters that lived in burrows, coming out mostly at night. I kept scrolling, each photo worse than the last. Wide open mouths, fangs like pincers, hairy bodies. Some were the size of a grown man's hand. I set the phone down, my skin crawling all over again. I didn't even realize how many times I'd brushed my legs that day, how many times something might have been closer than I thought. The articles said they weren't venomous, which was supposed to be comforting. But then I saw the comments, people talking about waking up with bites, about finding them under sleeping bags, in shoes, in tents. One line stuck in my head: they'll follow your shadow to stay cool. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my motel window made me flinch. I kept imagining one of them crawling up from under the bed, drawn to the dark. The next morning, I packed everything, checked my bag again, and drove straight to town. On the way, I passed a roadside gift shop. A man was selling t-shirts and keychains with desert animals on them. One of the shirts had a big cartoonish spider printed across it with bold letters that said, "I survived the desert crawlies." I almost laughed, but it came out wrong. More like a dry exhale. When I got home, I told myself I was done with desert hiking. I'd stick to forests and mountains from now on. But even now, months later, sometimes I'll catch myself glancing at the corners of my garage or under my shoes before putting them on. And every once in a while, that image flashes in my head again. Those thin, twitching legs coming out of the sand, slow and deliberate. They say camel spiders aren't dangerous, and maybe that's true. I Googled it again just to be sure. The search results all said the same thing: they don't kill humans. But if you scroll far enough and look at the pictures, you'll understand why I don't care whether they're dangerous or not. Some things you only need to see once to know you never want to see them again.